Hello, everyone. I'm Janine Donnelly, Manager of Webinars for Tech Channel, and I'd like to welcome you to our presentation. We will be holding a Q&A session at the end of the webinar. You may ask a question at any time during the event by entering it into the Q&A panel. If you experience technical difficulties during the webinar, please use the Q&A panel to alert us, and someone will assist you. You may download a PDF version of the slide deck by clicking on the drop-down menu labeled Event Resources. You'll find that on the left side of your screen. And know that you can download those right from the platform without being disconnected from the webinar. Today's webinar, Top Causes of CICS Transaction Spikes, is sponsored by HostBridge Technology. Our featured speaker today is Russ Teubner. Russ is CEO and co-founder of HostBridge Technology, a provider of CICS integration, orchestration, modernization, and analytics software and services. His pioneering work in CICS integration includes bringing JavaScript to the mainframe and a U.S. patent pertaining to XML enablement of CICS applications. And so with that, Russ, I'll turn the presentation over to you.
Janine, thank you very much. And also, I just took a look at the attendee list. I just want to say thank you to everyone who's taken their time to join us for this hour. It's a privilege to have you here. I hope that we've arranged some content here that you'll find very interesting. And as always, if you hear something during this webinar that you'd like to follow up on personally, please call us. We'd love interacting with our customers, with meeting and chatting with people in the industry and around the world. So if you see something here, first of all, ask a question. And if I can't answer the question today, we'll get back with you with an answer. But also, if there's something you'd like to see in more detail after we've gone through this presentation today, by all means, just reach out and let us know. We spend our day interacting with our customers and others in the industry, and we love it. So with that, let me just begin and make a few bits of introduction. Just in looking at the attendee list, I know many of you certainly are aware of who HostBridge is, so I will not belabor this. We've been in the CICS-specific integration business for well over 20 years. As you might imagine, our customers kind of line up in those industries that have historically used IBM System Z as a platform for a long, long time. Banking, insurance, manufacturing, logistics. But that's not to say that we just focus on those areas. We have customers from state government to federal government to higher education to common education. And our customer base at this point in history spans roughly from Bangkok to Kuwait City. So our team has a lot of experience in this area, and we would love to add value to your organization if that opportunity were possible. Let me describe a little bit about who we are as a company and what our mission is. It's very simple, and it hasn't changed. We create industrial strength integration and analytics software for CICS. We do this building on the foundation of industry standards and the power of System Z. Whenever IBM adds new features to the platform, we want to be right there leveraging those new features, whether they're in the hardware, the operating system, or in CICS. Obviously, all of us, both we as a vendor and you as customers, want to make sure that everything we do in and around our mainframe applications are safe and secure. So that is clearly top of mind for us. But what really gets us up in the morning and what really makes our day is when we can help improve the bottom line of our customers and move their business forward tactically and strategically. That to us is a very good day when we're able to participate in your organization moving forward. There are really kind of two sides to the company now. One is our long-standing practice in and around integration software, and that's a product, or I should say kind of the crown jewel of that side of the company is a product called HBJS. It's a server-side JavaScript engine, runs on Z, under CICS, and on zip. And it acts as a very powerful integration platform for producing and publishing APIs off the mainframe. But today we're going to be focused on integration analytics, which is kind of the newer part of the company. It's the part of the company that I've been spending a lot of time in personally, working with customers, taking in requirements, and then pushing forward the development agenda. So we're going to be focused on integration analytics today, and really won't say that much about the integration, kind of our traditional integration software. We've titled this presentation Understanding CICS Spikes, but as you'll see, in many organizations, what began as a spike for certain reasons actually ended up maturing into a structurally elevated level of CICS transaction activity. And we're going to try to peel back the covers a little bit using our analytics software to be able to understand why this is occurring. Now, we're going to focus on a couple of case studies, but by no means is that exhaustive. I mean, literally, I kid you not, every day, every week, we are looking at customer data through the lens of our analytics platform and seeing situations, seeing opportunities, seeing problems. Now, let me first introduce our analytics framework, and it's really quite simple, but it yields some incredibly elegant outcomes. Now, as you would suspect, as an integration-focused vendor and working on analytics, we are trying to observe and analyze the myriad of interactions that are happening to or with or coming at your mainframe running CICS, whether that's coming from customers, business partners, whether it's coming from automation platforms like RPAs platforms, whether it's coming through web servers, HAT, CTG, AppServe, whatever it is. You've got all this flow of activity coming into the mainframe. And the objective is to gather data about that activity in a very unique, non-intrusive way so that then we can gain insight as to what's really going on. What is the business value, for example, of all that activity? This particular product or framework we call HTAC, the HostBridge Transaction Analytics Connector. And when I use the word connector, it's not so much talking about connecting, your mainframe to something else. It's really, think of it as more like connecting the dots. We want to be able to expose the interrelationships between the activities on the outside of the mainframe and what's happening on the interior. HTAC, the part of the product that runs on the mainframe, is really structured as a series of very high performance CICS exits. They gather various bits of metadata, and they cause that metadata to be added to the SMF 110 records that are already being cut. So we call that process enrichment. The next process is transport, getting that information down to an analytics platform. And we happen to use Splunk quite a bit, only because most of our customers, if not all of them, have Splunk for some purpose. So we tend to use Splunk as our platform. Not to say we couldn't use something else, but our standard set of dashboards has been fashioned around Splunk. How the data gets down there, we refer to that as transport. Frankly, we don't have a big vested interest in how the data gets down there. You might FTP it. You might use a product like IronStream from Precisely. You might use IBM's Common Data Transport or Common Data Provider. Lots of different ways. But once it gets down there, that's when the fun begins. That's when we can put it under our microscope and analyze that data and be able to see all of the pattern of interactions that occur. Now, one of the starting points of this whole journey for us as a company regarding analytics was I received a call one day from a friend at a large global logistics company. And he said, Russ, we have a problem. And I said, okay, great. I love it. If you want to make my day, by the way, just call and say, we have a problem. I'd like to talk about it. And this diagram you see here is what he said so much in his words. He said, our business volume is growing nicely. He said, our business is not one that just grows exponentially, but it grows nice, steadily over time. And I said, well, that sounds great. What's the problem? And he said, well, our mainframe transaction volume is starting to grow asymptotically. It's starting to go exponential. And we're trying to figure out what exactly is the root cause of this activity. Because, and he was very honest, he said, if I put a pencil to the incremental cost, the delta in what it takes to now fulfill that increase in business volume on the back end, he said, I'm not so sure we're making money. We need, and he kind of described, he said, what I need to make sure that as my business volume grows, my workload scales such that I'm always, I don't mind using incrementally more mainframe resources to handle the business volume, but my back end resources shouldn't be spiking like this. So that was really the launching point almost 2-3 years ago now that really shot us as a team down this pathway to really be able to understand, not only in this organization, but many others, what exactly is going on. Because really he was asking a question or making a statement. I can't connect the business value of outside the mainframe with what's going on the inside. In other words, we've got all this transaction activity. What's it from? What's the business value? Maybe it's worth this amount of resources, but maybe it's not. And so before we go too much further, we'd like to put forward a polling question. And that is, in your estimation, and obviously all of these responses are anonymous, so just say whatever your impression is. No one's going to hold you accountable to it or see your answer. But how well do you understand how your business activities really impact or translate into CICS transaction volume and CPU utilization? Janine, let's launch that poll.
You got it, Russ. It's out there, and we actually have some responses coming in. So let's give it a couple more seconds as it compiles everyone's answer.
Unless there's a final surge, it looks like full understanding is declared loser based upon our experience with customers. That does not surprise me.
Why don't I go ahead then and launch these results to the audience? We may still have some responses come in. Here we go.
Yeah, great, thank you. Well, as everyone can see, the very limited and partial seems to be capturing the bulk of the votes here, and with about 12.2 coming in at full understanding. By the way, if you are one of those, congratulations. You've done an excellent job, and you are in the minority. We find, just anecdotally interacting with customers day in and day out, that the clearly very limited or only partial understanding is kind of what the experience that most people have. And really it is that. This chart is what really frames why we've developed the HTAC product, and particularly why we develop the dashboards that we do. It's to try to create that level of understanding. Okay, let's dive into the details then. Now, there are many causes of CICS transaction spikes, and as I've already said, calling them spikes is a bit of a misnomer, only because what begins as a spike tends to stick around as kind of a structural increase in the workload. But two of the areas that we're going to focus on today, and that we focus on week in and week out with customers, are looking at what we would call CICS hybrid integrations and desktop RPA, bots, and macros. Those two categories of activity really are spiking or structurally elevating a lot of the CICS transaction workload that we're seeing. Now, the interesting thing is that what we also see is that we have sources that are causing transaction volume to go up, but there's a multiplying factor, and that is inefficiencies in the CICS environment. And I'll show you a couple of use cases about that, because this basic equation is really what we see happening now that we have kind of a microscope to be able to see and detect what's going on. Elevated transaction levels multiplied by kind of inefficiencies, hidden inefficiencies often in the CICS environment, yielding a significant amount of wasted System Z resource. And it's really solving that equation that that kind of gets me up in the morning every day. So let's talk about cause number one that we've kind of referred to humorously as hybrid integrations behaving badly. And this is an actual customer use case. I won't go into the nature of the business, but this is real. They are in a very, what we call, complex distribution segment. That is their business. They have a platform. Well, let's just put up the diagram here. It'll become obvious. They have a lot of users who are sitting at browsers. They are interacting with a very sophisticated integration server that's actually, creating a web-based UI for them to interact with. And then what's happening on the back end between that UI/integration server and the IBM CICS environment are just a storm of transactions. Now, in this particular situation, I can tell you verbally, just to give you an idea and make this more concrete, the integration server, or the thing that is creating the UI out to the end user, is a product from IBM called HATS, Host Application Transformation Server. But it really doesn't matter. It could be HATS, it could be LegaSuite, it could be UiPath, it could be a lot of things that sit in the middle tier and create a beautiful user interface to end users. But then sometimes their connection, actually not just sometimes, frequently, their connection to the back end CICS application is through extremely rudimentary mechanisms, such as terminal emulation and screen scraping. Now, let me show you how bad it can be. Now, one of the things that our analytics platform does is it analyzes this whole pattern of interaction and creates what we call a DNA, kind of a robotic process automation DNA, or macro DNA. Now, and what you're seeing on the screen is an example of that DNA. So we simply gathered the customer data, they sent it to us, and we began to analyze it. Now, just so I know that text in that box there that I've highlighted looks kind of obtuse, but let me just decode it for you. What that means is that the transaction named DIMS was run. It was run through pressing logically an enter key, although it came from there's no human involved. It came from an automation platform. And that yielded a screen where the BMS map was term MA3 and a map set called term MSM. And the program that actually sent the map was called term DI, and that *2 means that it happened twice in a row. So you can see this is just a very small snippet of DNA. Now, by the way, this is, again, let me just emphasize, really small. We find lots of macros and RPAs that are executing hundreds, if not thousands or tens of thousands of such transactions. But let's look at this DNA a little differently and ask ourselves, what's going on here? So I've broken down that DNA, what looked as one sequence of interactions, really into its constituent parts, because when we showed that to the customer and to the people who wrote this macro, they said, well, it's really not one macro, it's 5 macros. And I said, okay, so help me understand that. And so you can see here we show, here's the activity of macro 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Now, and clearly, each of these macros are interacting with a terminal-oriented transaction running under CICS, and they're extracting data from CICS using screen scraping, which for all sorts of reasons we would say is a terrible idea. But nonetheless, this is a reality for a lot of organizations. But let's look at those macros. The person who wrote these macros was really attempting to be a very good developer of such, using such a tool. In fact, they wanted to write each macro so that it not only defended against a bad citizen macro, but it also wanted to be a good citizen. So what did it do? Well, when you're interacting with terminal-oriented transactions like this using emulation and screen scraping, before you do anything on a screen, you need to make sure that you know what screen you're on. So every macro, the first operation it does is it clears the screen so it can put the CICS app in a known state. And then it does whatever it's going to do, even if it's only one transaction. But then the last thing it's going to do is it's going to clear the screen so it can leave the app in a known state. In other words, it's defending against any bad citizens, and it's trying to be a good citizen. Now, what's the net result of that? Well, as you can see here, I've highlighted in yellow all of the interactions with this transaction that are doing nothing but clearing the screen. In fact, there is more unproductive CICS interactions here than productive ones. And let me just say that when we did the math, it turned out that fully 55% of all of the transactions being run through this mechanism were, for lack of a better word, overhead. They were unproductive. They had no business value whatsoever. They were just clearing the screen. This is the sort of information, these sorts of patterns that we can deduce and readily detect using our HTAC analytics component. This is the sort of actionable intelligence that allows organizations to make significant changes in the way the integration is occurring, and thereby lowering the cost of ownership, not just for the non-mainframe components, but those components that run under System Z. Let me show you another cause. Here is another use case, real customer. We call this RPA bots and macros gone wild. Now, first of all, let me just clarify that generally speaking, we're a fan of robotic process automation. We think there's a real significant business value that those sorts of products can provide. But when RPA platforms start interacting with back-end mainframe CICS transactions using crude and inefficient techniques like emulation and screen scraping, bad things happen. Stated differently, implementing an RPA platform or developing a bot might be simple and fast, but it can be extremely inefficient. And it can lead to elevated transaction volumes, escalating resource consumption, and net really poor end user experience. We see a lot of people, through a lot of organizations, who are beginning their journey around RPA platforms as really needing to rethink their API strategy. These poorly conceived APIs, particularly APIs that what we would call are technology oriented around particular screens and programs, they become chatty, they become costly, and frankly, they become unscalable. The trick is to isolate the problem, because not all bots and macros are bad, but all bad bots and macros definitely need to be eliminated. And so let me show you what a bad bot looks like. This is a global IT solutions firm. If I said their name, you would know them. They have a global field sales force around mostly Europe, North America, South America, and Asia. They are interacting with via Excel and various other types of RPA platforms all day, every day. And what do those Excel spreadsheets and RPA bots do? They send thousands, and in some cases tens of thousands of discrete interactions back to the mainframe to run screen-oriented transactions. Now, I know that I'm going to zoom in on this slide a little bit, and the next time we do this, a webinar on this topic, I'll make sure we do a live demo, because I know you can't read this very well, probably. But this is just one of the analyses that are included with the HTAC dashboard set, where we can look at a particular, or essentially isolate particular robotic or macro sequences so that we can assess its impact and see exactly what it does. Now, in this case, I hope this slide's a little bit better. We can see the DNA. Now, in this case, we left off the DNA that showed the BMS map and whatever. But you can kind of see this is a real-world macro that is working its way through a set of transactions, and it's essentially screen scraping data off the screen. And it did. This particular macro or bot ran about 1,500 transactions. Now, again, at this particular organization, I think the worst case scenario we've run across is a server that cranked up somewhere around 6 o'clock Pacific time every evening and runs a sequence of terminal-oriented transactions, roughly about 250,000 at a shot. It doesn't take much imagination to understand the absolute inefficiency of that sort of an approach to achieving integration. When we look at use patterns like that, it really reminds us, and then we remind our customers, that we have got to build APIs to the mainframe around achieving efficient integration. And the number one problem we find are technology-oriented APIs. These are the APIs that expose a single program, or, in the case of doing emulation and screen scraping, just interact with one screen. But of course, no one interacts with one screen. They interact with hundreds or thousands of screens. But these sorts of technology-oriented APIs tend to create extremely chatty interactions that are the root of all sorts of overconsumption of resources on the back end. So we need to rethink integration for performance. we are a big believer that in suggesting to our customers that they think in terms of business level APIs, not technology APIs. In other words, a business level API should be fashioned around, get customer account summary, a function call like that, not 10 different API calls that say, get checking account, get savings account, get home loan, get this, get that, get whatever. Create business level APIs. And I also would like to camp out on this last point, because whenever we see these sorts of integration patterns involving highly chatty APIs, whether they're driven from terminal emulation or whether they're driven by HTTP, it really doesn't matter. But our recommendation, our strong urging to customers is that they implement microservices smartly. A lot of people have interpreted the microservices architecture as meaning that the more granular the request, the better. And we'd like to say that there may be times where that's true, but by and large, creating these tiny, tiny technology-oriented API calls to the mainframe just simply runs up the overhead and the cost factors on System Z. So as you implement microservices, do it in a way that does not yield brittle, poor-performing integrations, and make sure that your approach toward using microservices doesn't lead to simply spraying the mainframe with voluminous requests. We're seeing this more and more, especially as RPA and other automation platforms are really coming into vogue. So we're trying to raise a caution flag there that says, build APIs for efficient integration. Don't just let it happen around technology-oriented APIs. Now, we've postulated that all of these factors that increase the level of transaction volume, when you add those together, sometimes they have a multiplying factor related to host inefficiencies to yield an astounding, sometimes an astounding wastage of mainframe resources. And let me show you 3 case studies of inefficiencies that our analytics software has detected. This happens to be an auto insurer where, as you would imagine, the most important thing that they want to do is be able to add a vehicle to a policy. But they realized that that was somehow becoming extremely expensive on the back end. Well, what Integration Analytics revealed is that adding one policy, again, because we're stitching it together end to end, we could detect that adding one vehicle to a policy spawned 7,000 DB2 calls, and that's not a typo, which generated 14,000 TCB switches, which generated millions of unnecessary instructions on a per policy basis and in aggregate during the day. The to-do here was very simple. Call the vendor and have them modify and have them alter the definitions of their application so that their apps are running on the CICS Open TCB to avoid the TCB switches. Another use case comes out of public education, very large, maybe the largest public school system in the United States. They happen to be a HostBridge customer, and so we were doing a health check with them using our analytics platform. And what we were able to detect is, we obviously see, is that there's lots of people in their administrative departments who are interacting with a very beautiful, robust set of applications running on a Microsoft .NET platform. But then they too were just pounding the mainframe with discrete requests. And so we looked at this and also in the process of looking at this, we were able to detect that they had not applied the necessary CICS maintenance to ensure that a certain set of pervasive encryption features were run optimally. In other words, what we were able to detect is that every user ID and password validation was costing them more than they imagined and running up their CICS CPU time. Also, what it revealed is they really need to continue to put pressure on moving toward rationalizing or creating better, more impactful APIs. If an end user does one thing and it results in hundreds of discrete interactions with the mainframe, that is prima facie evidence that the API to the mainframe has been poorly defined. It's just been miscast. Here's a final example. This is a vehicle manufacturer, very heavy equipment, worldwide concern. What Integration Analytics revealed here is that, again, departmental applications spread around North America were interacting with a particular application on the mainframe. But because of certain settings under the covers of CICS that had actually been made long ago and forgotten about, they were cutting far, far too many SMF records. They had flipped an option on that was causing CICS to generate an additional SMF record for every user event monitoring point that was triggered. And lo and behold, it turned out that 20% of all their SMF records came from these so-called user event monitoring points. Now, just imagine that. If you could reduce the overhead by 20% for all the SMF records that you create, that's real resource. That's real money. And so they're in the process now of remediating that. These are just 3 cases where it's easy to see how, with an expanding load or volume of transactions, and then multiplying those by some of these hidden inefficiencies, can yield CPU consumption patterns that are wasteful and unnecessary. So let's begin to summarize. So why are people interested in this? When obviously we think it's certainly providing good value. But when we ask customers what attracted this to you, here's what this is a collection of not only their thoughts but ours. And that is, it is certainly time that we begin to scale the distributed side of these organizations with the mainframe in mind. In other words, so much scaling has occurred outside the mainframe. And CICS and the mainframe, thankfully, it's just an incredibly scalable platform. But still, what's happening is that all of this distributed activity at scale is causing needless resource consumption on the mainframe, simply because a lot of these highly scaled distributed environments have really hit critical mass. What that leads to is organizations need to begin to think about optimizing their integration strategy. They need to particularly look for the low-hanging fruit, look for the worst-case scenarios. Our analytics platform can do that. Maybe there are others, but regardless of what tool you use, it's time for most organizations to take a fresh look at their integration strategy and optimize around it. We also, using our tools, it becomes really obvious quickly that there are often a critical need to do a bit of refactoring and do a bit of modernization. In other words, if we see or detect a repeated sequence where someone is repetitively, sending in a sequence, whether it's an HTTP sequence, a sequence coming in through CTG or MQ or whatever, if we see a repeated sequence where they're constantly running a sequence of programs in a row, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, boom, 8 programs all in a row, it's clear that points to the need to modernize and refactor that application. Because if you're always, why would you want to send in 8 requests and do all the work and suffer all the overhead for 8 when 1 will do? So what we try to do with our platform is to point out where modernization can really be effective and where it will be in the money. Also, just improving performance in general, as we've seen. Okay, all of that is intended to give actionable insights. And again, I regret that I can't necessarily go live right now and show you some Splunk dashboards. If you'd like to see some, just send us an email. We would love nothing better than to do a personal demo for you or your team and actually show you how all this works. In fact, doing this has now become something of a process that we are working through with a number of customers. We have customers now who will send us a set of 110 data after they've installed the HTAC software in a test or production environment. We then process that. We can do some basic evaluation and dashboarding, and then we come back to our customers with a kind of a formalized presentation. And that whole process takes anywhere from about 2 weeks, maybe 4 weeks, depending on how much data or what we see. Now, when all the dust settles, this is what you can expect from an engagement like that, or what you can expect from a good analytics assessment. One, you're likely to find areas or opportunities for tuning. As we mentioned, you're also likely to find areas where application modernization is in order, where a bit of refactoring can perhaps lower your request response volume by a factor of 5, 10, sometimes 20 or more. It also usually points to the need to create a more formal integration architecture around business level APIs. And of course, that is our stock in trade with our analytics software, HBJS. But sometimes, oddly enough, it's really not about technology. Solving the problem can be as simple as picking up the phone. I've told this story many times where we have one customer, and I was looking or reviewing with them some of the information that we yielded through our analytics platform, and I hypothesized that what I saw was a particular problem that should be solved by creating an API around a particular category of work. And the customer kind of chuckled and said, "Oh no, it's far easier than that. All I have to do is pick up the phone and tell that user that we retired that particular application a year ago, and instead of running that RPA bot, all they need to do when they come into work every morning is just go to Microsoft SharePoint and pull down a PDF that we generate overnight." So sometimes it's just a simple fact that in large, global, complicated organizations, when you make changes with your infrastructure to improve things, sometimes the word doesn't get out fully or completely. And so being able to have a microscope like HTAC and seeing what's really happening can then lead to some additional training, some additional business process modification, or simply picking up the phone and reminding someone that they no longer need to do or transact business like that a solution has already been arrived at and deployed. So really that's the summary. The advantage that we're gunning for when it comes to analytics is first and foremost transparency. We want you to see what's driving your mainframe, what's driving CICS transactions. We also want to make sure you can see fully and completely where your time and money is going and where it's being wasted. And then lastly, we want to make sure that it's very obvious where you should modernize first. And we believe that the right way to do that is by connecting the dots between what's going on outside of CICS and what's going on the inside. Janine, with that, I think I'm going to take a sip of water and let's do some questions.
Great, Russ. We do have some questions, so let's get started. First question, how can you be certain that terminal-based integration is overusing CICS resources?
Good question, fair question. First of all, what I'd say is if you were to install our HTAC software, our set of exits, and we were to let them run and add bits of metadata to the SMF 110 data, and if you were to send those to us, and then let's assume that I put those into our analytics platform, I would know within approximately 15 minutes whether or not you have that problem. I mean, so for us, given the level of analytics that we've developed at this point, there's really just no question. We'll spot it. You'll see it. So I can be, the reason I can sound so certain, first of all, is because we have the analytics tool to actually see it. We can detect all these repetitive patterns. Then, we're not subject matter experts in your application, but we can certainly show you what we're seeing so that you or your subject matter experts can look at that. And frankly, we have, knock on wood, we're batting 1,000 right now. Every time we've done an analytics assessment with someone, we have shown them either A, use cases where terminal-oriented transactions are being run in very wasteful ways, or other wasteful activities. For example, we just did a review with a top 10 bank in North America. And we looked at we just looked at a tiny, tiny slice of data coming out of a test environment. And as a result of that, just looking at it, a casual assessment and a phone call with their subject matter expert, we were able to show them how they can reduce their CICS transaction volume by 50% for all of their HTTP traffic. So as we kind of say now, the data doesn't lie. So there's really not a lot of, once we ingest some data, or you ingest the data into the analytics platform, the data is what it is, and it tells us, and we just follow the data.
Wow, Russ. Okay, I'm going to go ahead, if you don't mind. I'm going to advance to this next slide. So folks who want more information after the webinar have your contact information, and we do have more questions coming in. Can you talk briefly about CICS thread reuse using protected threads or pool/entry threads with an eye towards CPU savings?
Well, only to a degree. I'd probably need to get my DB2 guru on the phone. But clearly, what we can see when we look at the 110s is we can see that interaction between CICS and DB2, and I'm just assuming the context here is DB2. But I suppose it could be, let's see, I could also see that question being cast in kind of a Java kind of threaded environment in a CICS address space. But what we are able to do by virtue of seeing since we have the full SMF 110 down on the analytics platform, we're able to do all sorts of math and be able to look at all sorts of interactions, transaction to transaction. So we're able to gauge the level of thread utilization, but also TCP switching. I mean, we all know that TCP switching under the covers of CICS can be a very bad thing, a lot of wasted overhead, but you'd be surprised how much is still going on, even though we've been focused on it for quite some time. I might just also use this question to say that we're doing some work with a customer right now who is a very, very heavy DB2 user. And so, and frankly, just looking at the 110 data coming out of CICS did not yield the level of insight that they needed to really see kind of the cost and the integration that was going on to the back end. And so what their goal is to be able to say, okay, I've got an end user that does an activity, one or more CICS transactions run, but what they really want to gauge is what's it doing all the way to DB2. So we're just in the early stages of gathering requirements to be able to blend in a deeper look at DB2, because our customers, now that we've shown them, you know, the integration patterns and the costs from the outside world to CICS, now they're wanting to kind of connect more dots and go from CICS to DB2. So, Kim, I think I came from you. If you have any thoughts or ideas about that, and what you think that would be powerful and useful, let me know. I'd love to gather, your input.
Thanks, Russ. Okay, you struck a nerve with this attendee who says, we have employees who've been developing and using macros throughout our enterprise for decades. How can we know where these macros are running and what kind of impact they're having on our CICS regions?
Well, let's take that in two parts. What's the impact? Well, as you've seen, we can easily see and sense the macro. We can also gauge the impact because if I were to show you that on a dashboard, I can show you exactly how much real time and CPU time was consumed by the macro on under CICS. But not only that, I can also show you the IP address of where it's coming from. So, I guess what I would say is, we have built the analytics platform to do exactly what your question presupposes, and that is we will be able to tell you exactly where the macro is coming from, the origin IP address in your network, and we will be able to show you the DNA of the macro, and we'll be able to show you how long it took in both real time. We'll be able to tell you how much it cost in terms of CPU time. And we also then, once we get the DNA of the macro deduced, we then do a bit of magic, and we then are able to tell you over time how often that macro is being run. Because most of the organizations using this tool, they want to order their priorities around the worst case scenarios. So for example, we did an engagement with a customer last month where it was clear that, well, in fact, if I'm going to go back in the slide deck just a little bit, and if you remember slide 14, this particular macro that it was coming from a automation platform, HATS, and it was running this. Well, this macro wasn't running just once a day, it was running thousands of times a day. And so when we did the analysis to find where should they focus their attention first, it was clearly this macro. So the analytics platform will actually tell you exactly which are the worst case scenarios and what you should remediate first.
Very helpful. Okay, this thought occurs. Wouldn't a solution to these problems or kinds of problems you're describing be to replatform applications off the mainframe to eliminate the integration altogether?
Well, that's an interesting question, especially being asked to a mainframe guy like myself. But let's go with it. Let me just be philosophical for a minute and say that if your organization, if you're on this call, your organization owns a mainframe, and the odds are high that the reason you still own and operate a mainframe is because you have good and valuable, strategically important apps running on that Systems E mainframe under CICS, period. I mean, I'd be willing to make a bet. If it were easy to get your application off the mainframe, it would have already been done. That would have been done last decade. But it's probably not. There's probably a reason why it's there. And so the premise of the question of wouldn't it just be easier to move it off? The answer is no, it wouldn't. But even if you did, that doesn't save you from integration. I mean, we live in a hybrid world, right? There is no one single platform that saves you from the need to integrate smartly, robustly, efficiently, and in a performant manner, right? It's just, so we live in a hybrid world, and even if you waved a magic wand and you moved all that COBOL code or whatever it is to a different platform, you are still going to be asking, how can I effectively achieve performant, resilient integration to that code? We believe, I mean, on the basis of both our analytics offering and certainly our integration software, HBJS, there is absolutely no reason why you cannot achieve performant, robust, reliable integration to existing applications, even if they're screen-oriented apps running on System Z.
Okay.
Let's see. I just saw another question that came in. If we don't have Splunk, what might be the alternatives? Well, there are a couple of them. First of all, thank you for the question. Very frequently, what we do with customers is we'll use one of our Splunk instances. So what we would do is we would provide to you the HTAC software. And again, that's just the software that you install in a CICS environment. It's just a couple of, it's a number of exits, trues, and they're styled as task-related or global user exits, extremely efficient. People run these in production. We understand why you might put them in test first and then go to prod, no big deal, but they're very efficient. What we would do is provide those exits to you, let them enrich your SMF 110 data, and then send us a slice of data. That's a great place for the journey to begin. We'll take that data, we'll ingest it into one of our Splunk instances in a very secure, sequestered manner, and then use that as our platform to do our initial interactions with you. Now, so that's how we would go about it, kind of very tactically, working with someone that didn't have Splunk. Or even if you have Splunk, you might still want to just send us the SMF data and let's do a basic analysis on it before we go before you go to the trouble of ingesting a lot of data into your Splunk instance. But this does tee up an alternative, or a good question, and that is, what might be alternatives to Splunk? We're currently looking at some various alternatives. The one that shows up as the most obvious alternative is to use the Elastic platform, the ELK platform, Elastic Logstash and Kibana, and maybe using a user interface tool like Grafana on top of that. We are beginning to consider that. It's nothing we are supporting formally today, but we're kind of taking our cues from customers. So if that is something, Dave, that's interesting to you, I'd love to talk to you and understand what your analytic platform alternatives might be, because that would really inform our choices and our R&D plan going forward.
Thank you, Russ. That's all the time we have for today. So I want to thank everyone for attending today's webinar. There's so much interest in this topic, Russ. I especially want to thank you for sharing your expertise with us today. And be sure that you watch for our follow-up email. It will contain a link to the recording of today's webinar. I know you'll be interested in that. That concludes our webinar. Thanks again, everybody. Have a great day and stay well.